Welcome back to A Time to Think, where today Chris and I go
Toe to toe.
toe-to-toe.
Oh, wow.
Chris thinks I'm funny. That's a good feeling.
Yeah.
I feel
I
recognized.
affirm you. I
Yeah.
affirm you.
So in our past two episodes, as we're ending this book, Strange New World by Carl Trueman, if you haven't picked it up yet, it's a really good read. I think it's going to be more and more important for Christians to understand these concepts and understand the, I guess I've said underbelly a couple times of these concepts. And we're kind of getting into some practical things now about how does the Christian move forward. In this episode, we're going to talk about the nature of tolerance and bigotry and how does the Christian respond to these things. And in the next episode, we're talking about how does the Christian create a culture in the church that wars against the culture outside of the church, not just in opposing ideas, but in being more beautiful, more good, more true. In our last episode, Chris, we talked about recognition being that when we desire to be okay, we desire to be affirmed, we express it, and we have to have a society around us that voices back, that's good, right? And so we see that in the sexual revolution is people in unstable places expressing their sexuality, expressing and needing the culture to say that's good.
Right.
Well, the next question happens, Chris. What if someone doesn't say that? What if someone instead says, that's not good?
Yeah.
I don't believe that's good. And this might be the most practically applicable episode we've had for the Christian, because that is where we find ourselves. That is where people find themselves with family they disagree with on this issue, whether those family are just different in their political leanings or are non-Christians, or maybe even in the really hard place of having friends or family who are in the LGBTQ community and they're dating someone or they're getting married and now you're forced to make some choices.
Yeah.
What do I say? How do I act? How do I involve myself? So, Chris, we're talking about these ideas of tolerance and bigotry, which are kind of the responses to the nature of being recognized. As you've seen, you've mentioned hate speech as something you want to discuss on the podcast prior episodes. As you've seen over the last 10 or 15 years, the evolution of claims of bigotry and hate speech, how have you seen that change and grow?
Yeah. I mean, I think first to be noted is that it's a word that carries power. Right? So to use the term hate speech is a powerful term. And when I say powerful, I mean literally powerful, like it's full of power, because if an individual comes and says, what you're saying is hate-filled, that carries with it social and at times legal weight, so that if somebody makes the claim, it'll be investigated.
Right.
It will be, the individual will be put on trial, potentially, either socially or legally, put on trial for saying something that has basically carried the weight of secular humanistic heresy. So, I mean, it's a big deal for somebody to level the charge of hate speech. And so
bigotry in that same category, or is it less so because it's not illegal?
Yeah, and I think bigotry, interestingly enough, bigotry is the unspoken disposition behind hate speech. And so if somebody speaks in a way that's perceived to be hateful, they're guilty of hate speech, but they're also guilty of an underlying disposition towards the individual or not the individual, the group, right? So this is categorical, this is intersectional. I mean, this is just how groups play against each other. The individual is a bigot who is expressing hate speech, right? So if you are a builder who builds homes, like you're a builder and you build homes.
Right.
With hate speech, you are a bigot who has speech filled with hate. So I think that's evolved over the years because, legally, you go back several decades, hate speech has always been protected, the idea of hate speech. But I think the term hate speech has changed in the cultural vocabulary because hate speech in the past was just defined as speech that is perceived to be bigoted speech, right? So like deliberately inflammatory speech.
There's intent behind it. There's usually like an incitement of violence behind it. It's much more clear, but now it's leveled pretty willy-nilly.
Correct.
And I think one thing you and I have tried to get across to folks, Chris, is that in cultural discussions, we should always have our ears looking for personal attacks first.
Sure.
Now, there are persons who are incredibly hateful bigots,
right.
and I have no problem at some point saying that is bigotry.
Right.
That's just not okay.
Yeah.
But we want to listen. Does someone level that first? Is that their first response? Because is it ad hominem attacks? Is that the personal one?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the culture we're in right now, Chris, is we're in a culture of ad hominem attacks. And it goes both sides. Someone says, I don't agree with having bathrooms open to both sexes, and it's a bigot. Someone says, I'm really struggling with the gap in how different races are making different amounts of money. Woke.
Sure.
Okay, so we see in our culture that we are really quick to level personal attacks, and part of thinking and being thinking people is saying, ooh, okay, am I quick to level a personal attack first? And secondly, if someone else is leveling a personal attack at me first, like you're a bigot or that's hate speech, we haven't actually engaged in any type of meaningful discourse before that point. And we just want to be aware of that because that's where this thing gets cattywampus, is we can't even have a conversation because before the conversation, I now know Chris is a bigot. Well, you know what I do with bigots? I don't listen to them.
Right.
They're fundamentally so flawed in their thinking that I don't want to hear their thinking. And that's the point.
Yep.
The point is, I don't have to listen to you anymore because you're fundamentally so flawed.
Yeah, I mean, I used the term just a few minutes ago, but I think it warrants repeating. It is the equivalent of heresy. You know, you think about what in the 16th century Roman Catholic Church, charges leveled against Martin Luther. You go back to the 15th century to Jan Hus. Like these are men who were threatened with, if not all the way, gone through death sentence because they spoke. And interestingly enough, they spoke. Luther's works were brought in front of him to recant. They were words, and they were not words that were. I mean, of all the reformers, Luther was very clear about the fact he wanted to bring Reformation to the Roman Church. Right. But it was his words that challenged ideas that were found to be so problematic that he needed to recant words, speech, ideas, and so. I think as this has evolved over the years, this idea.
And Luther had his. He had his words that might have should have been recanted.
Yeah.
But,
absolutely.
But what you're talking about is not those words.
Correct.
Like Luther, particularly in some of the ways he talked about Jews because of the theology, he was really harsh in a way that, oh man, you should take some of that back.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
But what you're talking about asking to be recanted was merely an exchange of ideas, not of personal bigotry. Yeah.
I mean, when he goes to the Wittenberg church door, posts the 95 Theses, the statements that he is taking issue with, which for public discourse, I mean, that's what the church door was for, was to challenge the public discourse. That became problematic. So, what is carried with this idea today is really the same full weight and force as the 16th century Roman Catholic Church carried out, and then you even go to things like the Inquisition. I mean, to go really extreme here, the Inquisition was individuals who, there were certainly individuals who were pursued by the Inquisition that were actively doing things, but other people that were just thoughts. So the Huguenots in France, there were physical conflicts that occurred, but at the end of the day, the Roman Church pursued the French Calvinists because they had differing thought patterns. And so one of the things that became championed out of the Reformation, out of this era in the history of Western civilization that said, we're going to kind of return to being charitable in the ability to welcome thoughts, differing thoughts, competing ideas.
And being charitable involves assuming that the person expressing disagreeable thoughts might not be a disagreeable person.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
That there's a way in which I might disagree with Chris, and I can still possess some sort of, and maybe even a prevailing thought that Chris is basically in line with basic human dignity and these types of things. And so I can listen to him, I can exchange ideas in a way that doesn't write him off. And you said something that I think is helpful here, is that the Roman Church saw ideas that needed to be squashed. Mm-hmm. And we talked in past episodes about power and institutions, mm-hmm. and a couple of presiding themes from those is that there is a new established institution, and that would be of the sexual revolution, of mm-hmm. gender affirmation, of these types of things, that would, though not as pervasive as the Roman Church, that would kind of be the one in position of squashing right now.
I would say it's more pervasive.
Really?
I would argue with you.
Tell me more.
On that point. So I think it's more pervasive because
that's an interesting position.
Yeah. So
I like this about you. Stir that pot.
The Roman Church, even though it exercised physical power and authority, it could be avoided in a way, right? So like, you could have private thoughts in your own home that would not be perceived by the authority.
Okay.
Right? So like, the Pope didn't show up in your home to tell you you're wrong. You heard through differing parties like, oh yeah, this is wrong, don't believe this, whatever. And if you were actively espousing these ideas in public, you would be challenged and brought before the magistrates to be addressed. The strange thing that happens today is that because the institutions of power in our culture have shifted largely away from physical enforcement and political imprisonment to cultural and social shame, the institutions of authority and power in our current system are generally those institutions that communicate ideas to people. Mm-hmm. And ideas are communicated through media. Ideas are communicated through communication systems. And so the institutions that have the greatest power in our culture today are broadcast communications. It is, digital communications, anything that allows for people to communicate thoughts. And I think what we've seen over the past 2 years, 3 years, since the 2020 election specifically, is an increasingly bold and naked laying bare of the authority of these systems or these, corporations, I guess we'll use the term corporations, to step in and to regulate the ability of people to receive competing thoughts. Mm-hmm. And it is more pervasive, I would say, than the Roman Church
because it can enter into your home.
It enters into your home, and it can do it at any time. And even if you don't want it to enter in, I don't want my family to be communicated with by individuals who suggest that unbiblical sexual behaviors are good. I can sit down and watch it. I can watch Jeopardy with my kids, and I'll still have to come face to face with somebody who is advertising to me the goodness of a family that has 2 fathers in it. My kids have to deal with it. I can't escape that in the way that 500 years ago somebody could just be in their home and not have to deal with other things.
And so that would be the new establishment, and that was something we unearthed earlier, was in an attempt to overthrow the establishment, there's become a new one.
Yes.
And that establishment must seek to exercise power, because as we've discussed with Nietzsche and Marx, when you overthrow objective morals, mm-hmm. someone's got to fight for power. Yep. And we see that, namely in the need to squash intolerance and bigotry, right? And so that's where we bring us to today, is that there is a continued push just to rid public discourse of anyone. I think it was Ryan Anderson's book he wrote called When Harry Became Sally. Yep. Amazon took it off the shelves. Yep. Abigail Shire wrote a book and she's not a Christian. Ryan T. Anderson is a Christian, so sometimes you're like, oh, okay, well, the Christian got taken off the shelves. Sure. But Shire is not a Christian, and she wrote a book basically about what is it called when you see a group of kids transitioning together? It's like a social contagion theory,
okay,
I think is what it's called. She wrote a book about that, and was I think she was removed from Target for quite some time, and so that is the hegemonic power, if you will, that is squashing dissenting voices, which brings us as Christians to how do we operate with a dissenting voice? Because we've been dissenting this entire time, right? I'll take it back to a conversation that I had years ago. I went down to Nashville, was sitting at a brewery with some friends from high school, and they were kind of just asking for life updates, and I told them that I thought I was going to go into ministry. And so this was probably 2017. And 2017 feels like a different world.
Yeah.
Because though it's 2 years after Obergefell, the level of pride parade type things and the level of media advertisement nowhere near what it is now 5 years ago, right? But still, there was already the cultural push that same-sex marriage is good, and that affirming that is good. And so someone I went to college or to high school with said, "Well, is your church affirming?" And the Lord blessed me with enough self-control to ask a follow-up question rather than just getting defensive, and just said, "What do you mean by affirming?" And he said, "Well, do you welcome people into your building who are gay?" And I said, "What do you mean by welcome?" And what I was trying to get him to the point is saying that I, as a pastor, and we as a church can see someone who we disagree with their sexual practices walk into our church, and I can treat them with dignity while also disagreeing with their sexual practices. And we had a good conversation there. He disagreed with me, overarching, but I think he was able to see that the choices aren't bigotry or affirmation, that there's actually another choice, namely the Christian choice, which is to actually treat people in a dignified manner even when you believe they are in sin.
Civility.
So I think, Chris, one of the things Christians have to do is get really good at acting not like a bigot when they're being called a bigot. I'll give a non-gender scenario. I was talking to a family member years ago about IVF. What is it? In vitro fertilization? Yeah. So that can be a hot topic, especially in the Catholic Church, right?
Sure.
And so this family member was coming from, all of her family was in the background was the Catholic Church, and this family member had another family member who struggled to get pregnant, and so they ended up doing IVF, and all of their Catholic family pretty much just scoffed at them and shunned them to a degree. And so what this person I was talking to, what she saw was unthinking, uncaring, essentially bigotry. Like you're just looking and saying, that's shameful, that's wrong, you don't even know what you're talking about. So we're talking, and I said, well, have you considered the fact that many Christians are concerned with what happens with leftover embryos? That when you do IVF, you might create 7, 10, 12, or 20 embryos, and if I'm a Christian and I believe that embryo is a human life having begun, then it would make sense that I would be against in the practice of creating a bunch of human lives to set them aside.
Right.
And she said, I didn't think about that. I guess that makes sense that you would hold that position. Didn't mean she agreed with me. Didn't mean she radically changed her position. But what it did mean is for the first time, she heard a careful, thinking, caring person disagree. And she was able to say, yeah, I guess that does make sense. And I think that has to increasingly, I'll be even more clear, in that moment, I had already been met with like can you believe these Christians think this way type of frustration. And I had to choose to not be offended by that, but to instead calmly and clearly articulate a disagreeable position for her. I think that's where we are right now, is we have to be able to receive the term bigot and not be bigoted. And because I think people, in large part, will be confused by that. Say, I think Chris is a bigot, but he actually seemed really compassionate.
He's a compassionate bigot.
I don't know what to do with that.
Right. You know, it's funny because going back 2,000 years, it's not a new phenomenon. I mean, in the Bible, we hear the Apostle Paul saying that your reasonableness be known to everyone.
Right.
Like that's a defining characteristic of a Christian in the public square, is to be reasonable. It doesn't mean that you're going to agree with people. I mean, you may say things that are inflammatory just on the nature of what is being said. And so I think as a church, something that we've talked about over the years in terms of our preaching is that like the gospel is offensive enough on its own.
Right.
We don't need to add offense to it.
Right.
So like if we're just honest with the gospel, that's going to tick somebody off because it's offensive to people who want to maintain control over their own lives in a way that basically sticks their fist in God's face and says no, right? So, and that's the natural human disposition. The gospel comes and challenges that. People say, oh, I don't want that. That's going to incite a response. We don't need to add to that by contributing personal sin in the matter to be filled with anger towards those who disagree or anything like that. The gospel will do its offending work on its own. And so what we have to contribute, just like when it comes to matters of ethics, sexual ethics or otherwise, is to say, this is what God says. Not going to be a jerk about it, but this is just what it says. Here's why. I'll communicate to you this way, and you can take it or leave it, but just know I'm not here to destroy your humanity in the process of communicating with you.
Yeah. How do you think we operate, though, Chris, in appealing to divine revelation when increasingly people don't care about divine revelation?
Yeah.
Because in my conversation with my friend 5 years ago, he grew up in and around the church. He disagreed with many of the doctrines of the church, but he at least knew the Bible, knew what it said. And so I was able to say, hey, buddy, you see how, like, we're clear that the Bible is anti-homosexuality. He's like, yeah, we're clear. Yeah. Okay, well, we're clear that the Jesus is Lord and he gets to tell us. I'm like, yeah, we're clear. It's like, so you see how me believing that Christ is Lord and is against a certain practice, that I got to believe that, right? And he was able to say, yeah, I disagree, but I see how you got there.
Sure.
I don't know that we're in that climate anymore.
Yeah, and I don't think that we necessarily are. I think certain pockets of the country, I mean, here, there's still a decent enough in Wisconsin, the upper Midwest, in the South, what people call flyover country. There's still enough of an environment where people have a religious heritage in ways that the coasts don't necessarily experience. That being said, there's a pastor who is kind of infamous now, at least within our circles, because of our commitment to Scripture, our commitment to the glory of God and the gospel and everything. There's a famous pastor, son of a famous pastor, large church in the South, in fact, who basically came out and said, don't appeal to the Bible anymore. Because this is, the culture has shifted, don't appeal to the Bible anymore. Don't talk about it. And I just think it's plain wrong to do that, because the Christian's authority is not ultimately based when it comes to speaking on matters of ethics or otherwise. We're not claiming authority coming from ourselves. And that's foolish. Like, you displace yourself in the spot, because, what we find that when we call other people to standards is the same thing we would be mastered by ourselves, right? And I think that's what people often lose sight of when it comes to discussing issues that are contentious with others. Like, I'll point out an issue that I think is the church has been hypocritical in some ways for, maybe the past 30 years, is the issue of divorce. For decades, the church was very clear that divorce is not honoring to God unless there are certain very clear standards that are met in that process. In cases of adultery or, physical violence, those types of things, the church kind of abandoned its voice on that matter. And so, you can see how somebody who would come from a gay, lesbian background would say, like, you're a hypocrite. You're a hypocrite. And the problem here is that when the Christian just removes himself or herself from speaking from the position of what God says about the matter, see, the non-Christian can come and say, well, your holy book that you say you believe says that divorce is bad, so why are you condemning me? And you've got a church that's filled with 25% divorced people who may not have ever even thought about the legitimacy of divorcing your spouse, right? So when we come to have these discussions with people, I think it's important to say, you know what? The Bible also does address that matter, and we're being mastered by this book ourselves. And so we don't want to function from a place of we pick and choose what's important, but we say, this is what we ourselves are going to be judged by. Like, judge us by these standards, just as we would speak to you regarding the same.
Yeah, I think you're right there that we talked in previous episodes about the pro-life argument and how people would say, well, you're not pro-life, you're pro-birth because you don't do all these different things, and or you really don't care about insert these subsets of people. And the attempt was to say, if I can show your hypocrisy, I can invalidate your argument. But what you're saying is, if the argument is the scriptures, then we'll just keep going back there. And if I need to change, we can change together, but we're going to change based on that standard. And I think you're right, Chris, because we've also talked about how destabilizing the current cultural moment is, and the only stabilizing force there is going to be divine, long-held truth.
Yeah.
And so the advantage the Christian has in appealing to divine truth is to say, this one is held up. Your thing is 10 years old, max.
Yeah.
Your thing is changing and wavering. Your standards are all over the place. Yeah. The standard's been set here.
Yeah, I mean, as an example, just to kind of put it in illustration for people to think of. I mean, I love football. Football season's on its way. By the time this is posted, might be underway, in fact. But love football. And, you know, last year, the Packers kicker, Mason Crosby, had a really awful year. Really awful year. And a number of factors went into that, but things like the snapper had issues, the holder had issues when he's kicking field goals. And you think, like, what is, you know, we think that there's an advantage to developing our own systems of evaluation for what is good, right? And so at the end of the day, hate speech, bigotry, this comes from what is good, what is evil, you know, so you can assess the moral quality of an individual based on what you perceive to be hateful and so forth. But looking back at last season's kicking for the Packers, the special teams unit was pretty awful. At least there was a field goal post that was always in one place that, you know, you think, all right, is Mason Crosby doing a good job as a kicker? Are the snapper, holder doing a good job? No, right? And so, like, the goalpost is always there. And so you know that he's doing a good job or a bad job because there is actually a standard. If you want to get 3 points from kicking a field goal, here's how you do it, right? But today, because we shift the goalposts, you know, we're like literally shifting the goalposts all the time. Like, where do you line up on the field? Where do you kick at? How can you evaluate? Was that worth 3 points? Was it not worth 3 points? And so I think when we come to discussions pertaining to authority and these types of matters, like, the Bible is a fixed goalpost. Whether somebody likes it or not, at least it has that going for it. And then evaluate it on its own standards, on its own merits, go for that. But I think that's where we really kind of need to settle as Christian people when we have discussions about these matters, saying this is an authority, doesn't change.
Yeah. One final thought here, Chris, I would say the Christian needs to know that disagreeing is not denying. Because, another Twitter thread I follow, there's a gentleman named Delano Squires who's a pretty insightful guy. And he was engaging with someone from an opposite perspective, and someone asked him, can men get pregnant? And he said no. And that led into a big argument because the other guy was saying, well, trans men can get pregnant, and he said no, men cannot get pregnant. And so his thing was, I'm just going to say this simple little phrase that everyone understands, but the response was, you're denying the existence of trans men.
Right.
And so what happened is there was a disagreement. Can men get pregnant, yes or no? And that was, you're denying the existence of a person. Right. And what the Christian has to say is, no, I'm not. Right. Because I don't believe existence is based on your cognitive awareness of your biology.
Sure. Yep.
I believe your existence is based on many other things. And so the Christian just has to be really careful that when someone accuses them of denying or hate speech or bigotry, they're able to pull back and say, actually, no, I just disagree.
Right.
I disagree that you should identify yourself based on your sexual preference. Let's have a conversation about that. I disagree that your existence is based on interpersonal happiness. Right. Let's have a conversation about that. And that's actually exactly what we've been doing for the past 12 weeks, is pulling back to have conversations about these underlying things so that the Christian can say, no, I'm not denying you exist. Right. I'm disagreeing with your priorities. Right. And those are, I think that's a disarming thing and something we have to be prepared to do.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for taking some time to think. I hope that we've given you some tools that if you encounter someone accusing you of intolerance or bigotry, you're able to kind of step back and from that reasonableness, Chris, that you talked about from the Bible, be able to address those concerns.
Yeah.